The Las Vegas Raiders have had a really nice offseason so far, which was much needed after a 4-13 season. So in this video, I want to talk about the Las Vegas Raiders and why I think they are a sneaky playoff contender in 2025. Subscribe if you're new. Let's hop into it. So I think the best way to start the video off is by going over what they've actually done this free agency, because it's actually been somewhat impressive what they've done so far. Now here is a quick little summary of what they've done. They've signed Jeremy Chin, Alex Kappa, Eric Stokes, Landon Roberts, Raheem Mostert. They traded for Geno Smith. They re-signed a number of players while also handing out some extensions. They also did lose a number of key players, releasing Gardner Minshew, releasing Andre James. They also lost out on a few other players like Divine Diablo. So now you kind of look at the depth chart here after their free agency moves, and while I still think this Raiders team does have some obvious needs, I also do think it's not a very bad roster. Let's obviously begin with the biggest, most headline move they've done this offseason, and that's of course bringing in Geno Smith and also replacing their head coach with Pete Carroll, who is somebody who coached Geno Smith. For the most part, I like the move for Geno Smith. This was a Raiders team that ever since they let go of Derek Carr hasn't had their quote-unquote franchise quarterback, and even though I don't think Geno Smith is like their extremely long-term answer at quarterback, I do think for potentially the next 2, 3, 4 years, Geno Smith should and likely will be the guy. This also puts them in a situation where they can take a quarterback in either this year's draft or next year's draft and develop them underneath Geno Smith, so you're starting to build up a lineage of quarterbacks where you have Geno Smith play for 2 to 3, 4 years, and then after that you have your new franchise quarterback come in and hopefully be developed by the time he starts, and then he goes on and has a 15-20 year career, sort of like, Aaron Rodgers with, Brett Favre, or Tony Romo with Dak Prescott, or so on and so forth. Or I guess the most popular one that we talk about often is Alex Smith to Patrick Mahomes, but that's kind of what I think this Raiders team is hoping to get out of Geno Smith. Hopefully they can compete for titles and compete for, playoff appearances with Geno Smith, and then hopefully with after Geno Smith and likely after Pete Carroll, you just have somebody else step into those roles seamlessly after 2-3 years. In terms of who is Geno Smith in the immediate future, Geno Smith is a great quarterback. He's one of the better quarterbacks in the NFL. I think Seahawks fans maybe give him a bit of a bad rapport, a bit of a bad rap, and that's not because I don't think Seahawks fans disliked Geno Smith. I think they were just disappointed with how the team performed in general, and I do think a lot of the fans put a lot of the blame on Geno Smith. And even though I do think he should take some level of accountability for maybe the lack of success for the Seahawks, I also don't necessarily think the Seahawks built a very good roster around Geno Smith. I mean, the offensive line was really bad for that team. The running game was inconsistent because of the offensive line, and defensively, while I thought they were good at times, it was also an inconsistent defense, especially in the early portion of Geno Smith's time with the Seattle Seahawks. So even though the Seahawks never really made much noise in the playoffs or really were ever serious contenders, I don't necessarily think that was all Geno Smith's fault. Now you could say, well, if you're a quarterback, you should be able to elevate the roster around you, and while I do somewhat agree with that, at times the roster is just so poorly constructed, at least in certain portions of the team, that a quarterback simply cannot overcome it. You look again at that offensive line that Geno Smith had last year. I thought Geno had a really solid year and was making a lot of big time plays, but that was typically in spite of really poor offensive line play. So now Geno Smith heads into a team in the Las Vegas Raiders, and I like their offensive line. Colton Miller, the left guard position's up in the air, whether it's going to be Jordan Meredith or Alex Kappa. Meredith did look pretty good in the short time he played last year, so we'll keep an eye out on that one. Jackson Powers-Johnson at center, he can also play guard. Dylan Parham, and then DJ Glaze, who it does seem like will be the starter. I've heard that Pete Carroll actually likes DJ Glaze, so we'll keep an eye out on this offensive line. It does look pretty solid on paper. There's also some depth there with Thayer Munford, Jordan Meredith, so on and so forth, so I feel okay about this offensive line. And if you're Geno Smith, it's probably the best offensive line he's had, at least in the last couple years, so you got to feel pretty happy about that one. Obviously, the weapons right now for that offense are very dire. Like, receiving is just not a strong suit for this team. Geno Smith is going to be throwing the ball, obviously, to Brock Bowers, who's maybe the best tight end in the NFL already, or one of. I mean, he had a fantastic rookie season, and the sky is the limit for this guy. I think he's going to be potentially a future Hall of Famer if, of course, he stays healthy and keeps this up. He's just a whale of a player, had such a good rookie season, and he was doing this with, I mean, just horrendous quarterback play. Although I do like Aiden O'Connell, so shout out to Aiden. But yeah, I mean, Brock Bowers is fantastic. Behind him, you also have Michael Mayer, who I believe was a second-round pick in 2022 or 2023, who I still think has a good amount of talent, is a good inline blocker, can make some plays here and there. I think for a lot of other teams, I think they'd feel pretty happy about having Michael Mayer as potentially their full-time starter. For the Las Vegas Raiders, you have two tight ends who I think are starting caliber tight ends in the league, and one of them is a future Pro Bowl, all-pro level guy, and then Michael Mayer, I think, is a really solid rotational guy. With that said, this is the main core issue that I still have with this roster. Running back and wide receiver is still a desperate need. Right now, their RB1 is technically Raheem Mostert. As you can see here, Raheem Mostert would technically be their starting running back 1, then Sincere McCormick, Zamir White, and then receiving-wise, you have Jacoby Myers, Trey Tucker, Kyle Phillips, and then a whole bunch of guys who I would probably bet to say most people don't know them, and I'll just keep it a stack with you. I only know some of these names, and that's just because I remember them from college. So yes, I would say running back and receiver is desperately a big time need, and fortunately for this Raiders team, they're actually in a pretty solid spot at their first round pick where they can either take an Ashton Jeanty, who I would venture to say is likely going to be available unless Jacksonville takes Ashton Jeanty, which that would be kind of crazy, or they can sit in there and take Tetairoa McMillan and hope that he can pan out to be their wide receiver 1. Now, if it was up to me at that spot there, if I was to pick between Jeanty, an offensive tackle like potentially a Will Campbell or Kelvin Banks or Armand Membu, or taking Tetairoa McMillan, I think I would probably just take Ashton Jeanty because I think he's the best player on the board at that point. But at the same time, if you think that Raheem Mostert can still sit in there and be your starting running back for a year, then maybe you pass on him. Maybe you draft one in rounds 2 or 3 and then take a Tetairoa McMillan. I don't really hate that because I do think the second round receivers maybe aren't as good as a guy like Tetairoa McMillan, or if for some reason Travis Hunter were to fall, then that would obviously be ideal, but I don't think that's going to happen. So all in all, I look at this offense and I think there's a lot of extreme bright spots, but I think there's also some serious negatives that have to be addressed. There is still a couple free agents out there, like Stephon Diggs is still a free agent, Keenan Allen, Amari Cooper still a free agent, so they could bring those guys in, but I haven't really heard too much buzz, at least from what I've seen. I could be wrong, but I haven't seen too much buzz about those guys potentially going to a team like the Raiders. And same thing with the running backs. There's not really any decent running backs left in free agency. I mean, you have J.K. Dobbins, Nick Chubb. Maybe I would take a flyer on Dobbins, but I would rather just take one in this year's draft if I was the Raiders. So this offense, I think, again, has very big bright spots. I like Geno Smith at quarterback, Brock Bowers, Colton Miller's fantastic. Jackson Powers-Johnson, I feel really good about. And then, of course, you have some big time negatives. I think they need to address running back and receiver heavily with the remaining portion of free agency in the draft. But then that brings us to their defense, and obviously this is a defense that looks a little bit different from last year. Now, admittedly speaking, they did lose a lot of big time guys. Losing Trevon Moehrig in the safety room sucked. I think their biggest loss of the offseason was losing Robert Spillane. That one sucks, but I think they've done a decent job of kind of, covering those spots. For example, Landon Roberts steps in for Robert Spillane, had a 77.2 overall grade, 32 tackles, 90.4 run defense grade. Coverage-wise, obviously leaves a lot to be desired, but also Robert Spillane was kind of like that too. Obviously, the big difference between Spillane and Roberts was the snap count last year, and not to mention Landon Roberts is also 30 years old and only 238 pounds compared to Robert Spillane, who's a little bit bigger, a little bit younger. I would have liked them to have kept Spillane, but it does sometimes happen where you just lose out on a really good player to a bigger contract. And then the safety room, you obviously replace Trevon Moehrig with Jeremy Chinn and Isaiah Pola-Mao, who is now going to be stepping into a big time role next year. Again, I do think those are big time losses, but for the most part, I like the way they overcame those negatives that happened in free agency by bringing in quality guys. Like Jeremy Chinn had a really good year last year for the Commanders, and frankly, I'm kind of surprised the Commanders were not all in on bringing back Jeremy Chinn because of how productive and how important he felt for that defense. So if he can replicate similar success from the Commanders last year to this year with the Raiders, I think the Raiders are getting a really good player. Now, I don't think he's Trevon Moehrig. I would rather have brought him back, but he's a little bit cheaper and maybe he could be just as good next year. Same thing with Landon Roberts. It's only a 1-year, $3 million deal, which is a lot cheaper than what you would have had to pay Robert Spillane. I don't think it's a long-term answer because he is 30, but for the next year or two, depending if you re-sign him next year, I think you feel okay about it. Obviously, your defensive line, you're banking really big on Tyree Wilson to have a bounce back, I guess, third year now in the NFL. He hasn't really done much so far in his career, but Max Crosby obviously gets paid. He's one of the best pass rushers in the league. Christian Wilkins had an injury-riddled first season with the Raiders, so you're hoping that he can stay healthy and kind of look back to the typical Christian Wilkins that we saw in Miami. The second defensive tackle position is kind of up in the air right now. You have Adam Butler, Matthew Butler, Tyler Manoa, and then, of course, Jonah Lalu. I hope I said those names right. I still think maybe I'd like to bring in somebody a little bit more proven if it's available in free agency, or potentially by taking one depending on where you have picks in the second or day 3. 3, maybe you take another guy there. I think opposite pass rusher next to Max Crosby, again, depending on what Tyree Wilson looks like. You do have Malcolm Kuntz, and obviously that's pretty solid, but I think you'd maybe like to bring in somebody else in that spot to just have more depth there. I mean, Charles Snowden's also there. So yeah, I think for the most part, I just think depth is really the biggest requirement for that defensive line. Like, I think your starting 4 you feel okay with, but if you can find a second defensive tackle next to Christian Wilkins, if you can find more depth, and maybe if Tyree Wilson could step into a bigger role, that would be nice. And maybe this need wouldn't be so much because Wilson does have the ability to play multiple positions on a defense. But I do think for the most part, I would like to see them add depth in that. It wouldn't be a priority in round 1, especially because I don't know if there would really be a talent there, unless of course Abdul Carter falls. Then take Abdul Carter and you just have him and Max Crosby go stupid on offenses. But I don't think there's one available in the first round. Maybe second round, if you have one, then maybe you throw it in there. I also think linebacker potentially could be in play too. I think you might want more of a long-term answer over a Landon Roberts. This one also is a situation where I think I'm looking more into day 2 or day 3 for a future linebacker, especially because you can typically find decent linebacker play in the later portion of the draft as long as you develop them properly. The secondary, though, I do think needs upper echelon talent, and that would probably be a true CB1. With the pick they have in the first round, you could go Will Johnson. I think at this point in the offseason, it might be seen as a little bit of a reach because of his injury concerns and the inconsistent 2024 tape. Jahdae Barron is also in play, but I think that early in the draft also could be seen as a reach. Although I love Jahdae Barron, don't think I would take him that early, so I do think it should be an offensive player. But in rounds 2 or day 2 or day 3, maybe you look to see if you can try and find a corner. I also think there's a couple free agents available, like an Asante Samuel, who I think would be a nice fit for this Raiders team. I know he can't tackle, but he's pretty damn good in coverage. So just something to kind of keep an eye on, because I do think the secondary, while it has some pieces, Jack Jones, Eric Stokes, DeCamore and Richardson, Jacorian Bennett, Sam Webb, so on and so forth, I think it's lacking that true CB1-like talent, which is obviously extremely hard to find. But if you think you can find one, I don't think you think too hard about it. So all in all, what are my thoughts about this Raiders team? I think this Raiders team is really talented. Like, you look at it piece by piece, and yes, they have clear needs, running back, receiver, CB1, but really outside of that, this roster is really not bad. Like, for a 4-13 team, the team underperformed big time last year. I do think that's the reason why they brought in Pete Carroll, to get a proven head coach who's done it at the college and the NFL level, won Super Bowls with Russell freaking Wilson and that Seahawks team. And while I don't think this Raiders team is primed and destined for championships within the next 2 years, I do think that this roster has a serious chance to compete next year. Now, the one thing that's going to hold them back is they're in a division that I think frankly is quite good. You look at the Broncos, who've had a really good offseason. I'll likely make a video on them here soon because they've looked really good. Bringing in Hufanga, bringing in Greenlaw, I mean, that defense could be the best in the NFL next year. And then you look at the Chiefs. Obviously, they lost a lot this offseason, but it's still Mahomes, it's still Kelsey, it's still Andy Reid, so you expect them to be there. And then there's the LA Chargers, who haven't had the greatest offseason, but you still feel really confident about their future. Bringing in Najee Harris, their offensive line gets improved with Mekhi Becton. So for the most part, I do think the Raiders are playing in an uphill battle to win the division, but I do think this Raiders team has a very good chance of being really good next year and at least being in the conversation to make a wild card spot, especially if they do nail the draft and if they maybe bring in one more free agent to kind of shore up one of those other needs, like a potential receiver or something like that. So again, I think this Raiders team has a lot of talent. I love the move for Geno Smith. I hope Pete Carroll can step in there and, and be a great head coach for them like he's done in his past. Again, I want to talk about his age here. He is an older coach, so I don't think he's the long-term answer at head coach. Again, long-term answer. But again, kind of like Geno Smith, maybe you get some young hotshot offensive coordinator in there or offensive assistant or something like that who can learn under Pete Carroll for the next 2-3 years, and then maybe when Pete retires, he fills in that role, and then again, seamless transition into what you hope is going to be your future guys. So again, that's a little bit of some foreshadowing for what the future could look like. I think in the immediate future, this roster is really talented and really good. It just has some severe weaknesses that I think could hold them back. And again, when you look at the rest of the AFC, it is a little bit stronger than what it was last year, especially certain teams. So it's going to be quite difficult for them to make the playoffs, but I think they'll at least be in the conversation conversation, which is better than what they've been these past several years, where they just haven't really been in the conversation and they have top 10 picks. So again, with Geno Smith, Max Crosby, all these star players across this roster and quality role players, I think this team is primed for a really nice 2025 season. I do not expect 4 wins. I expect 8+, hopefully maybe 10. But we'll have to wait and see. You guys let me know in the comment section below. What do you guys think about the Las Vegas Raiders? Are they good? Are they bad? Love you guys. Peace.